Kaimere is a distant planet. It is defined by waves of life brought from Earth and set free to evolve independently in this new context. The indigenous life of the planet, swarms of microbes called magic by the people who live there, are what harvest Earth organisms and make copies on Kaimere. As the asteroid which concluded the Mesozoic never struck Kaimere, dinosaurs remain the dominant terrestrial megafauna. As covered last week, the years corresponding with the early and middle Jurassic of Earth was one of tremendous ecological prosperity in Kaimere. A vast series of jungles and wetlands spanned the continents of Nikar and Kyrule, and in this age of crocodiles, pseudosuchians were the dominant megafauna of the tropics. Dinosaurs were present, but generally small or relegated to the temperate zones, where the prosauropods being one of the only large dinosaurs in the tropics. Their faster metabolism wasn't much of an advantage in this hothouse climate where pseudosuchians could reach the same sizes at a fraction of the caloric cost. This efficiency is generally assumed to have been favored in the crocodile archosaurs as their populations rapidly filled capacity, leaving little room for the dinosaurs. Toward the end of what assembly paleontologists call the first Mesozoic dynasty, the top predator of the tropics was an enormous protosuchian called Tyrannosuchus, named for its superficial similarities to Tyrannosaurus as a large-headed bone crusher. Though their reign in the tropics was absolute, it was a dynasty on borrowed time. For reasons still debated, perhaps due to the planet's axial tilt or movement of the continents impacting ocean currents, Kaimere became quite cold. This transition occurred sometime around 152 million years ago. As with the ice ages on our planet in the later Pliocene and throughout the Pleistocene, there was not a constant state of low temperatures, and even the coldest years didn't see glaciers sped to the tropics, or even that far into the temperate zone. If there were, a constant cold and new normal may have been established. However, the spike and fall of global temperatures from around 152 to 145 million years ago meant that no region was stable enough for a lasting status quo. The old guard wasn't long for Kaimere. The protosuchians quickly became scarce. Endothermic dinosaurs were much better equipped to handle the tropics now that they had dropped around 8 degrees in average annual temperatures. This efficient endothermy that granted them greater size and population during the golden age of stability was now a liability in the absence of heat to supplement the metabolism of these pseudosuchians. The new arrivals didn't fare much better. Animals would be harvested, might do very well in the warm interglacials, then perish as things became cold once more. While the portal harvested from Earth's polar regions during the cold periods, they still weren't cold enough. This was not part of any formal dynasty, as this transition era was too unstable. Like Kaimere has been in modern times for the past 15 million years, this 7 million year period was packed with harvests, though like occurred especially during the Warring Clades period and Kaimere since the end of the Anchor period, there were not sufficiently stable conditions such that the portal could relax. Sauropods in particular seem to have rarely lasted long. The parasauropods, being not as pneumatic, consistently maintained their position over the newly harvested competition. At least some species were feathered, as demonstrated by the well-preserved specimens recovered near the Great Library. This animal, called Mammoth's Draco, particularly thrived during the Ice Ages, at times being the most abundant megafauna by a substantial margin. Their herds wandered through the fern, prairies, and forests, their generalist diets enabling the bulk consumption of whatever vegetation was available before them. It has been suggested that the boom and bust of their populations, which seem to mirror interglacials, may have influenced the fluctuation of the climate. There were likely other factors. However, the idea that an abundance of these animals could warm the climate and glacial flooding killing many herds might prelude coal eras has gained some traction. While some metriacanthosaurs were at least harvested and may have persisted in the tropics during the cold eras, it was the native theropods from Kaimere's southern temperate region which fared the best overall. By this time they had formed their own clade, often called the Coelophosaurs, named for the sinuses which formed crests in many taxa of this period in Kaimere's history. These sinus crests were not unique to them, as basal relatives like Dilophosaurus and even unrelated theropods also developed a similar structure, and many animals now recognized as Coelophosaurs do not have them, but they were exaggerated in many specimens of this period, and the name retains priority regardless. The Coelophosaurs were apex predators throughout Kyrule and Nikar throughout the Ice Ages, thriving especially in the glacial maximums when harvested tetanurans that thrived in the interglacials struggled or went extinct. In the 7 million years of Ice Ages, species in the genus Selenocephalus appear to have been the apex predators, with their largest members reaching 12 meters and 4 to 6 tons in mass. It has been proposed that the crescent-shaped sinuses may have helped warm the air they breathed, a benefit in the colder regions and seasons, but it likely also served as a display structure. The therocephalians, which had dominated over the mammals in the first Mesozoic dynasty, lost ground to mammals at this time. It is generally assumed that fur was a substantial competitive advantage in ways that it hadn't been in the dynasty past. While many modern therocephalians in the Permian Islands have fur-like integument, there's been some disagreement as to if this is homologous or analogous, perhaps independently evolving in the Aborfell therians. It could be that these larger sizes of a lot of therocephalians at the time put these animals in direct competition with dinosaurs now dominant, and therefore smaller Mesozoic mammals were more successful. Regardless, non-mammal therapsids were largely outcompeted and appear to have fairly quickly become restricted to a few tropical fern prairies, while mammals of the Eutraconodont and multituberculate harvested during the late Jurassic became the de facto representatives of niche they held on Earth. Though First Dynasty relics had surprising success in the Age of Crocodiles, this transition period was quite difficult for them as most were specialized for hot and humid conditions. Populations of aeroplankton suffered, and the filter feeders which supported the evolution of giant dimorphodonts went extinct, leaving a fairly impoverished sky during the Ice Ages. First Dynasty descendants were still the dominant megafauna of the southern continents, today comprising of Picardia, Arvel, and Kaishel, but the dynasties, as recognized by the Assembly and the Great Library, are centered around the territory, terrestrial connections, and activity of the portal, at least at a given time. For example, during the Mesozoic, the portal's territory did not include Arvel and Picardia as it does today, instead spanning between Nikar and Kyrule. So these regions naturally won't be the focus of this episode. As far as the dynastic regions are concerned, First Dynasty megafaunal relics became extinct in the known world, and the clades were only represented by a few tiny fossils restricted to tropical wetlands. 147 million years ago was the beginning of a million-year stretch of cold, the coldest that Kaimere had ever been since the First Dynasties, colder even than the coldest years of the Permian Dynasty, and colder than it would be through to modern times. In this time, land and sea peaked in their extinctions. Even Mammoth Draco and Selenocephalus, dinosaurs specialized for the colder years, struggled. Their eventual extinction would not come at the hands of this gripping cold, but at its conclusion a million years later. For reasons unknown, through continental drift enabling circulation of warm water to the polar regions is often suggested, the planet suddenly became warm. Kaimere didn't return to the humid hothouse of the dynasty previous. Instead, the climate remained fairly arid, but temperatures rose. Animals specialized to the Ice Ages struggled to adapt, and before they had a chance, a new harvest introduced a host of new flora and fauna from a near-identical climate both from Laurasia and Gondwana. These newcomers swiftly established a new dynasty, pushing the residents to the fringes. This was Kaimere's first Age of Dinosaurs. It is often quite difficult to identify when and where harvests occurred. This is increasingly difficult further back in time. Some Earth formations only have a few partial skeletons, so even if a harvest occurred in the same time and place that we have record for, we might never know if the few partial remains of Earth and Kaimere don't overlap. Occasionally, though, there is a proverbial smoking gun making pinning down the time and place a lot easier. This was the case when a partial skeleton of Allosaurus was uncovered in the southern crescent. It has been reliably assigned to Allosaurus fragilis. Other animals tentatively assigned to descended taxa are recovered from later in the dynasty, but this being not only the same genus but the same species means the assembly can confidently say that at least one of these harvests contributing to this dynasty took place in late Jurassic of North America. As material at the same site tentatively assigned to Saurophaganax has also been identified, this harvest was probably late Cameroonian, around 150 million years ago. A single Morrison harvest establishing this dynasty was a popular theory among the assembly for much of the 20th century. This is supported by a wide range of ceratosaurs, megalosaurs, sauropods, ornithopods, and armored dinosaurs, all corresponding with what we see as the Morrison Formation at the same time, between 150 and 145 million years ago. Regardless of what and where the ancestry occurred, it should come as no surprise that these fauna didn't stay recognizable for long. By around 130 million years ago, the apex predator of what is now southern Nicar was a robust allosauroid which rivaled the largest Carcharodontosaurids in size. This animal, called Pteroparaxis, is of disputed origin. Some consider it to be a descendant of Saurophaganax, while others consider it more likely that a lineage of Allosaurus became more robust independently. Regardless of this origin, this 8 to 9 ton giant had its pick of available prey. And oh, what prey there was! Parasauropods had ruled Kaimere during the Ice Ages, but now they were reduced to a temperate footnote. In the second Mesozoic dynasty, true sauropods had come into their own. Macronarians were quite common. Camarasaurids were among their ranks early on, as were brachiosaurids. Extinct species aren't known. As we learn more about our own fossil record, certainty diminishes. For example, a very common Macronarian early in the second Jurassic dynasty was initially called Camarasaurus bolondacensis, but as we've identified potential Camarasaurids from India, Argentina, Portugal, and England, there's increasing doubt that bolondacensis is indeed belonging to the genus Camarasaurus, so the rather unimaginative genus Paracamarasaurus was erected for this taxa. It's possible that many sauropods in this dynasty came from North America, but the fact that closely related animals can be found on Earth across the major continents has increasingly cast doubt on the initial assertion that the second Jurassic dynasty was the product of a single Morrison harvest. At least some animals could clearly cross what minimal aquatic boundaries were present. It's entirely possible that 5 or 6 harvests occurred across the Cameroonian and Tithonian throughout Earth, and we might not see much conclusive evidence either way. It is becoming increasingly favored that they are not of a single origin. It is likely that there were several harvests of both Laurasia and Gondwana at this time. Some are able to be assigned to a genus, others to a family we know of our own fossil record, and some are still up for debate if they are adaptive radiations of dinosaurs from the first Mesozoic dynasty, radiations from newly harvested dinosaurs that looked quite different from what we know of our own record, and some may simply not have been found yet. The fossil record of both Earth and Kaimere are so fragmentary that any connections can be drawn border on the miraculous. By 130 million years ago, halfway through the dynasty, A chimerosaurid called saurophalanx was the most common sauropod. Bite marks and 3 sites with both species found in conjunction with each other suggest saurophalanx was a favored prey of Pteropterorexis. Brachiosaurids didn't reach the abundance of saurophalanx as their chimerosaurid kin, but they did achieve some of their greatest sizes. Toward the end of this dynasty, around 115 million years ago, the genus Saurogeb had grown to a staggering 20 meters in height, making it among the tallest animals known to have ever evolved in Kaimere. Coincidentally, this may have coincided with the early evolution of Sauroposeidon on Earth, another sauropod named after a god of earthquakes, which attained similar status among our tallest animals. This coincidence did lead to some proposals of a harvest from early Cretaceous Earth at this time, but later studies have confirmed Saurogeb is a brachiosaur and Sauroposeidon is a likely Sophospondylon, a clade we will hear more about next week. Diplodocids were also quite common at this time of harvest throughout the dynasty. They were initially more abundant and diverse than the chimerosaurids, but for reasons unknown, they declined in abundance and diversity as time went on. Both diplodocines and apatosaurines have been accounted for. Diplodocines in particular had a spike in abundance early in the dynasty. Not only were they common, they became giants, with the longest animal ever known in Kaimere being a fragmentary skeleton of Menodocus with upper estimates of 50 meters in length. Rabachosaurids were a related clade of diplodocoids which in Kaimere seem to have generally been specialized as low browsers and grazers on the fern prairies abundant at the time. Their largest member, Altus Spinosaurus, was not as long as Menodocus, but larger overall and would have been among the tallest dinosaurs at the torso, even not accounting for its nominative high spines. Despite its extreme size, it would likely have been comparable in mass to the largest Saurogeb, as they were surprisingly narrow in build. These giants would have been very efficient at traveling between seasonally abundant food sources, much like the modern Modotan, largest terrestrial animal known of the known world today. This dynasty, of course, wasn't all giants. There were also a range of Thyreophorans. Stegosaurus, or a similar animal, has been confirmed early on in the dynasty, but it was more basal Asian stegosaurs that seems to have dominated the niche throughout the majority of the dynasty. There were also animals similar to Gargoyleosaurus, which became heavily fortified dinosaurs by the end of the Second Mesozoic dynasty, with Acrosaurus showing the trait at its most extreme degree. Indeed, Acrosaurus and animals like it appear to have established a heavy armored dynasty of their own, which remained dominant throughout the rest of the Mesozoic. Ornithopods and other bathyal ornithischians are quite common throughout the dynasty as well. Some became large, even up to several tons, but for the most part they remained small. Allosaurus was not the only successful theropods. Ceratosaurs and megalosaurs were in their shadows, but present throughout the dynasty. Coelurosaurs were introduced to Kaimere at this time. It must be said that the turnover wasn't absolute. A few parasauropods and coelophosaurs have been attested in formations of southern Kyrule, sampled by great library paleontologists, and indeed will be something to keep in mind for next week's episode. However, it must be said neither is found in the second half of the Mesozoic in Nikar, and warming trends of the dynasty favored these newer clades. A group of coelophosaurs also persisted in the temperate north. They were smaller and lacked the extreme crests of their southern giant cousins. As they got larger though, reaching competitive sizes before the newcomers could spread and prohibit further rise, they ended up being dominant in northwestern Kyrule and eventually spreading to be the top theropod in the northern temperate zone. With the biggest reaching around 4 tons and most much smaller, they weren't much to write home about compared to the 9-ton Pteropterorexis ruling the tropics. No, it was not their size which made them special. These are the only known quadrupedal theropods. Most other dinosaur clades, including the related sauropods, took to walking on all fours when they reached a certain size. However, it seems theropods of Earth did not follow this route. It is possible that to preserve the functionality of their claws as predators, but even though many lineages became herbivores, none got down on all fours. It seems that the wrist anatomy of these more derived maniraptorans simply became too derived too early to enable such adaptation of other dinosaur clades were so quick to turn to. The Coelophosaurs, however, seem to have retained a fairly primitive forelimb configuration, and this basal anatomy may have been key to a more plastic morphology. They didn't walk on their palms, as even their basal configuration would not permit this level of rotation. Knuckle walking or splayed posture also weren't directions they took, perhaps because, again, their limbs were at this point too derived. No, it was by folding their arms like a wing and resting their weight on their second digit that this lineage achieved such a novel posture. This meant their claws could still function in prey capture, but they weren't able to make a leisurely pace on all fours and be able to have robust forelimbs and head without the extremely lightly built frame of modern Megaraptorans have to compromise with. This allowed for a powerful build, and this new clade, called the Therosaurs, became quite successful in the north. Like most theropods, their torsos were compact and rigid. This was imperative for their unidirectional respiration, which was a key to theropod success. However, a downside of this was that they lacked the trunk flexibility for a swift or efficient gallop. When they ran, it was almost certainly on their back legs. Some therosaurs remained fairly small, only 100 pounds or so, suggesting this was an adaptation driven by balance, not mass. However, the top predator of the temperate northern forest at the time was the 4-ton Burkosaurus. This animal appears to have been superficially similar to Megaraptorans of modern times, but being much more heavily built meant that they were likely far more powerful grapplers. Sauropods were rare in these colder regions, but there were plenty of parasauropods and basal ornithischians for them to hunt. By the end of the dynasty, non-mammal therapsids were no longer found in sampled formations of Nicar. Mammals had entirely replaced them, likely establishing a hold during the Ice Ages, but it was secure and absolute by the end of the era. Protosuchians, rulers of dynasties past, was at the conclusion of the era reduced to a few armored herbivores and scattered remains of small predators. There's some evidence that the allochevrons may have persisted well in Kyrule, and indeed a possible relic has been found in the poorly sampled jungles of the modern eastern continent, but any survivors of the former lords were scattered footnotes, nothing more. The skies were no longer home to giant dimorphodonts, which were entirely dependent on the flying terrestrians, which were in turn reliant on aeroplankton that had diminished during the Ice Ages. Indeed, there seems to have been a few million years in the Ice Ages where pterosaurs appear to have entirely gone extinct in Kaimere. However, as the aeroplankton recovered, the newly harvested late Jurassic pterosaurs cut out the middleman and just became filter feeders themselves. A lineage of tiny rhamphorhynchids became specialized in the aeroplankton. Some then fed on the ample insects and other microfauna eating the aeroplankton, which in turn made the consumption of these fauna, opening the door for increasingly large filter feeders. Some filter-feeding rhamphorhynchids were a staple resident of the skies. Bolinodactylus was quite common in the later dynasty, as it became a bit more humid and in some formations became the most abundant pterosaur. Another lineage of rhamphorhynchids followed not as filter feeders but as predators. At the end of the dynasty saw the evolution of Pterocampsus, an ambush predator, which served as a template for what this lineage would go on in later dynasties. Like the giant dimorphodonts of the previous dynasty, they were specialized in killing flying prey with a single devastating attack. The first small theropods, reliably identified as birds, were introduced to Kaimere at the onset of this dynasty. However, during this dynasty, they seem to have been at their best in temperate zones, and not particularly common in the tropics. Metriorhynchids were among the many marine animals introduced early in the dynasty which thrived. With the passing of the ichthyotheres, these crocodile archosaurs were the most abundant large predators of the seaways, though pliosaurs were generally the top predators. Metriorhynchids had a tremendous adaptive radiation, with durophagus, benthic feeding, and macropredatory members, alongside the traditional fish specialists. This diversity was perhaps driven by competition from fish-specialized plesiosaurs and ichthyosaurs, which also thrived throughout the Second Mesozoic dynasty. Around 110 million years ago, corresponding with the later years of our early Cretaceous, a decline in tropical fauna and spike in harvests marked the transition between the Second and Third Mesozoic dynasties. Unlike most dynasties where some major event concludes the era, like volcanism or a sudden change in the climate, there isn't currently an understood reason for the end of the Second Mesozoic dynasty. True, the next dynasty was a bit more humid and slightly warmer, but not dramatically so, and the core studies suggest there was already a general trend throughout the second half of the dynasty. Therefore, it is likely it wouldn't be the sole cause. Disease introduced in harvest has been floated early on, but in the absence of evidence, it's difficult to say. Regardless of why, between 115 and 110 million years ago, Nicar and Cairul had a general transition of flora and megafauna, to a majority being from Gondwana, and only a few native large animals, and introduced from perhaps as few as one Laurasian harvest. This third Mesozoic dynasty will be covered next week. When it was first properly surveyed, the Jurassic Islands were initially thought to provide a lot of insight into this dynasty, but it didn't take long for researchers to conclude that the continental plate on which these islands form broke off of Nicar prior to the establishment of this dynasty. These are entirely distinct clades, which evolved independently and are only distantly related and informative in broad strokes. The sauropods, for example, are generally thought to be diplodocoids, and the large theropods, presumed nososaurs and possibly megalosaurs, but their anatomy and behavior are so derived after 150 million years of isolation that the assembly is generally reluctant to draw too many conclusions about the animals of this dynasty from their closest modern relatives. Cheers to Garrick for sponsoring this episode. These 4 Mesozoic dynasties have had a basic framework for well over a decade, but I've loved the chance to go through and give them proper attention. A special shout out to the newest member of my family, Wesley, for making sure I take breaks. Thank you to my Patreon patrons. Without your support, I couldn't devote my time to this project and its related works. Links above if you are able and interested in supporting Kaimere. Thanks again to Garrick for his sponsorships, and thank you all for watching. Cheers, folks!